there is no way this can continue. People will eventually just dump these places and go move into places where they can have some land and some square footage. And he was laughing about this on the recent podcast, saying how wrong was I, that human nature doesn't seem to work like that. We don't just pick up and go because you can buy a house in Kincardine, Ontario for $300,000. I mean, you can, you won't, you probably won't. And so some of these tendencies are very hard to justify, hard to explain, and why we live in such overpopulated cities where there is so much more land elsewhere. Just I guess this is just how we are. We want to be communal, we want to be in areas that are developed, we want to have the infrastructure to enjoy the niceties of life, and that is just I guess why these areas are going to be always attracting more immigrants, people who are looking for that lifestyle, that North American lifestyle, that come from a place that's not like this, right? I come from a place that's not like this. I was born in Russia, and having come here and having enjoyed the luxuries and niceties of living in a downtown core, I mean, I don't necessarily want to move out into areas that are remote either, right? I'm just one of us. I'm just another human enjoying the infrastructure that is there for us to enjoy. So we are going to see students really struggle, because they're entering an economy that, or sorry, not even an economy, we're entering an environment that's not designed to really accommodate them.
Welcome to Supply and Demand with Adam Nadler. This is a podcast dedicated to the real estate market in Canada, available now on YouTube, Apple Music, and Spotify. Konstantin, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks so much for taking the time, and especially today, you must be having a busy day because the Bank of Canada made an announcement and decided to hold the key interest rates steady. And I don't know, have you read the report today? Do you know kind of like how this decision came to be?
Well, I don't think the decisions are decided the day before the rate hike. I think they are evaluated in the weeks and months leading up to it. I'd say weeks probably more so than months. When we were talking about decisions on the rate announcement dates, they do have to look at the long-term picture, but they can't ignore the short-term picture, right? And so this is essentially one of the main topics as to what I always try to get people to focus is where we're going long term, and as well as what are the damages of short-term changes, right? So the decision for the Bank of Canada to hold the rate today is not, I wouldn't say it's surprising. I think it's on par with kind of the general dynamic in the economy in the recent 30 days. And that has to do with our GDP contracting in the previous month of July. There is expectation that spending is going to dwindle down in the next few months, as well as it traditionally does closer to the end of the year. And so the decision was to hold the rate still, watching the economy contract. This will hopefully give us enough room to not see a full-blown recession, enough room to hopefully, keep that ticker bouncing up and down enough that we can stabilize things, both short and long term. And I'd say that there is still a possibility that the Bank of Canada may choose to hike rates in October or December, because there are still two more rate announcements before the end of the year 2023. And the decision to raise rates during those two rate announcements may still come. It's just that in order for that to materialize, we have to see inflation probably bounce back up a little bit more, right? So we saw it drop down to 2.8%. Then it came back up to 3.3%. And so now everybody's sort of just sitting and watching and waiting to see which direction is going to go next. Is it going to keep bouncing back up, or will we able to sort of tame it a little bit with what's been done recently, and will we see it stabilize for the month of September, hopefully October, November, which is what everybody is hoping, right? Like in the ideal world, we are able to manage this inflation effectively by manipulating the rate hikes and whatnot, and we're able to stabilize it enough that no changes will be required for a significant period of time, because only after a significant period of time where no changes are required will we see any meaningful discounting.
Unless something radical happens
Unless a
in,
black swan happens, but you can't predict that.
right, of course, or war, pandemic, I mean, all kinds of things affect
Yeah.
interest rates.
And that bank goes under, you know, we see we see a rebellion and a government collapse in an oil-rich country, and then just watch the markets go nuts.
So in terms of just the, I guess, next foreseeable future, the next interest rate announcement is October 25th, I believe,
Yeah,
which is a while from now. I mean, we're entering the fall market now. The summer was a little bit slower.
yeah,
The economy definitely did contract a little bit as inflation did kind of peak up its head a little bit in July. But overall, there do seem to be some, black swan events that could happen on the horizon when we're looking at the kind of like macro picture of things. What's happening in China, right? Evergrande filing for bankruptcy, Country Garden you know, kind of teetering on the verge there, and they did mention that in their policy report today. I mean, I read it when they posted it at 10 a.m. and that was one of the things that they did mention in there as being a concern because it is so tightly, linked and kind of woven into the fabric of the global economy. So given all of that, I mean, looking at the global economy, Canada's not doing so bad. So why then do you think that we could see another another hike or two come for the rest of this year?
yeah. Um, it would have to do with Bank of Canada's inability to produce meaningful results, right? And when I say meaningful results, I talk about the way that politics work in 2023. Meaningful is being able to go on Twitter and post that Canada has the lowest inflation rate amongst the G7 countries, which is what our liberal government did when we reached the 2.8% inflation rate in the month of in the previous month. So like, you know, if we don't see any meaningful results and we see that there is no improvement, the pressure that the Bank of Canada faces comes from their historic inability to make meaningful moves when it really mattered, or waiting them out for too long and then scrambling for solutions. So I think we're at a point in the cycle with our sentiment towards the Bank of Canada and the Bank of Canada's sentiments towards the public, where they are being very cautious, right? So if it so happens that in the upcoming 60 days, or sorry, 50 days, because the October announcement, I believe, is October 25th. So if the next little while we don't see any meaningful improvement from a negative trajectory, which we have entered this month of September, because when did the report come out with a 3.3% inflation? About 2, 3 weeks ago. So if we're looking at, let's say, the next report also showing an uptick in inflation rate, then the Bank of Canada almost has no choice but to say, okay, we got to do something about this, right? The public is putting pressure on us to produce meaningful results, and they're just not coming. So if that's the case, then the pressure is on the Bank of Canada to make a move, and it may be a move another 25 basis points. So again, I'm not ruling out the possibility of rate hikes until the end of the year at all. It just has to do with the next report and the report after. This is like very much month by month, careful planning, because rate hiking is very delicate business, right? Like you can't just go out there and rate hike 100 basis points and expect no ripple effect. Like last time we did that last year, things have turned for the worse quite quickly. So again, meaningful. It has to be meaningful results, or we hike the rates. Meaningful results, or we hike the rates. No meaningful results, hike the rates, right? If we do see what everybody's anticipating with the spending sort of tapering off, and we're seeing reduction in the inflation rate for the next 30 to 60 days, then I think then we should be okay with no rate hikes until the end of the year, but the results have to look meaningful.
That kind of everything you said there just kind of reminding me of I think it was a tweet that you put out at the beginning of last year.
Hmm.
So I think it was January 2022, and I thought it was hilarious. By the way, if you don't follow Constantine on Instagram and Twitter and things like that, or X, I should rather,
Add the pocket broker right now.
at the Pocket Broker, he is quite entertaining, and
Thank you.
and I liked your kind of snarky tweet there where Omicron was just kind of locking everything down. And I mean, as far as variants go, it really wasn't that, um, you know,
It was what it was.
right. It wasn't anything that, we really needed to be locking the whole, country down for. But anyways, there was a lot of political pressure on the Bank of Canada, and they didn't move the interest rate.
Yeah.
And that's when you tweeted,
Yeah.
inflation,
Hold my beer.
yeah, hold my beer. Inflation, quote, hold my beer. So that's kind of landed us in this position where you are saying that, yeah, they do need to produce meaningful results, but sometimes they wait too long to react. And then when they do react, they way overreact. Or they, or they react too quickly and they don't react enough. So how do we kind of look at the situation and go and determine for ourselves when we're trying to make decisions, consumers are trying to make decisions, people who are trying to watch this are trying to make decisions for themselves, their families. Is the Bank of Canada overreacting or underreacting?
Um, I'm going to have a little segue here. There is a wonderful book. It was written by Thomas Hobbes in the 16th century. It's called Leviathan. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that piece of literature. Leviathan is a book that describes what it means to have an undivided government. Um, so the reason that we are having these issues of incohesive governance is because we have such divided government. We don't like, one of the other comical things that has recently happened in our government in Canada is we have experienced an immigration boom, right? We've seen over 1 million new immigrants enter Canada in the first 6 months of 2023, and this is all while we're having a housing crisis. Like, has anybody thought about where these people are going to live? So, when we're talking about the Bank of Canada and its necessity to produce meaningful results, it comes from the fact that we don't have government that's able to plan long term. So the government that's currently dealing with the issue is being kind of handed the problem and sort of told just, you're next, take the marathon stick, and now you have to run with it. And so um, the Bank of Canada is very much affected by the pressures from the public and has been highly scrutinized for their inability to predict and do things in a meaningful way. So yeah, they are going to be probably overreacting often. And so we don't know yet if the last 12 months of rate hikes is an overreaction just yet because we are still trying to figure out, how deep this recession ahead of us is really going to be, because we are certainly going to be going into one. It's just the hope is that we're able to sort of pull ourselves out of it quick enough, as soon as we see the house of cards crumble. So, um, you know, this example of the Bank of Canada being pressured to produce meaningful decisions is also the reason why, the immigration ministry in Canada did allow over 1 million people into Canada in the first 6 months of 2023, because they were told to produce meaningful results, right? And then another hilarious comical thing happened is that the immigration minister became the housing minister. And there's another hilarious thing that I thought was worth posting, which was just two Spider-Mans pointing at each other, and is the housing minister pointing at the immigration minister, because the immigration minister created a rental crisis, a crisis we already had, but it's just gotten worse in recent 6 months because all these immigrants came with no real place to live, right? And now this same minister is in charge of housing, infrastructure, and communities, and communities. I believe that's the full position. And he is now saying, "Oh, we should stop immigration." And this is the same man who was pushing all this volume during the preceding 6 months. Like, how much disconnect is too much?
I'm reminded of a quote by the economist of Thomas Sowell. There are no solutions, there are only trade-offs.
Hmm.
And a lot of what you just said kind of make me think about what's better, having a more centralized planning authority, right?
AKA China.
AKA authoritarian regime, right? And their real estate market ain't looking too hot right now.
Very true. The other side of the coin, right?
Or having a more decentralized platform. Now, having the housing minister and the immigration minister being both the arsonist and the
And
fireman
exactly.
at the same time, obviously not going to work. But you brought up a really good point, and I did want to touch on that because there is news coming out now that is largely being ignored. Where last year we took in over 1 million people, which was twice past the record. So it was 2 times what the previous record
Hmm.
was for all of Canada's history. I think our highest numbers ever were in the 485,000 ish.
That's about right.
And then if when we look at that on a graph, when those numbers come out, it's going to basically be kind of chugging along, moving upwards, and then all of a sudden go vertical. And that's what that graph is going to look like. Then this year, we were on track to hit about a 500,000 again, which is also very high for us. And then now we've kind of said that we're going to bring in over 900,000 international students. Now, when we did hit the over million mark last time, I was listening to a talk by Benjamin Tal, and he was saying, how is it possible that we hit those numbers? Well, it was just because we gave all these international students PR status
Yeah.
and they were already landed, they were already here because we couldn't bring in too many more people during the midst of a pandemic crisis. And so why is it that that is now the strategy? Is it to prop up our economy, prop up our dollar, bring in more foreign wealth without printing money? I mean, what is the strategy here that is, I mean, in some sense, seeming to work with our economy, and in other sense, in the other sense, creating massive housing crises, along with a bunch of other crises that we haven't even begun to feel yet. Like our medical system is nowhere near prepared to handle what we currently have. How are we going to handle a 2.5% increase in our national population year over year for multiple years? I mean, we are headed for disaster in many of these different areas. And so
Yeah.
does it make sense economically and then just not in any other sense? And is that why they're doing it?
It just the only way that the immigration policy in the recent little while makes sense is again if you only look from the perspective of having to show meaningful results, right? Like it's just if we lived in the era where if Canada was an empire and it had an emperor, right? And the emperor had good 40 years to rule the empire to produce meaningful results, we would be able to be a lot more in sync towards those general, communal goals. It's very hard to produce meaningful results when, your term is only 4 years.
Right. And all you're worried about is producing those results so you can get reelected.
Precisely, right? So the immigration boom is a little ribbon that we get to put on the liberal government for, doing a good job of bringing in so much additional workforce, so much talent, they could say, right? While completely ignoring the damage that it does to the Canadians that are already here. One of the other comical stories from Twitter was a mayor. I can't remember which town in Ontario, so I do apologize. But it was a mayor of one of the towns unable to qualify for the smallest of homes to be able to live in, right? Because she just simply wasn't making enough to even be able to qualify for the smallest of homes with her down payment, which is something that a mayor should be able to do in her hometown, right? So like we're having a situation problem where sorry a population problem where we have existing population struggling for shelter, we have new population entering also struggling for shelter, and now also struggling for the same employment opportunities. Now, another story that's also related to this topic that we're talking about is that unemployment situation. So Better Dwelling put out an article, I believe, around first week of August that talked about the unemployment hitting an all-time high for us right now because of unemployment rate amongst new residents hitting an all-time high in Canada because there's just not enough meaningful opportunities for work and the influx of workforce is so high, right? So we are essentially putting all these people into places like Toronto and GTA where the property market is unaffordable, shelter is unaffordable, and there's less employment opportunities than there would have been if, let's say, the immigration policy was more conservative or more controlled, right? So, I hope that we are just I hope that we are able to mitigate these things as they come. Like right now, the problem of immigration, the numbers for immigration being too high are, they're just numbers. And yes, there is some problem with housing, but the next issue is, well, what if 6 or 12 months go by, right? And these people are still unable to find meaningful shelter, find meaningful employment. Like could become a snowball effect. And also going into a recessionary period, what does that do to your employment rate? Employment rate? What does that do to your employment opportunities? So it is going to be a rocky ride for the next little while, and there's just no real way for us to do this um, but just through trial and error, right? Like I also don't like, as much as I have been somewhat negative talking about some of the policies that our government has been putting out for the past little while, it's also very hard to control such a big machine. So I should say that
Well, it's impossible.
yeah, it's virtually impossible. Like it's just so hard to control all these different levels and keep them cohesive. And cohesion is what's missing in a lot of these moves that we're seeing because they're just so all over the place, right? Like one problem comes up, we sort of solve it, but then it kind of, another problem arises from within the same solution. Um, so I really don't know how we're going to be able to mitigate all these things long term because um, the effects of these changes is not often seen immediately. It's seen typically there's a bit of a lagging effect for when you start seeing problems coming from these changes and these kind of influxes. So I'd say like we'll be talking about this topic again next summer.
I'm also very interested in this whole concept of over 900,000 international students. It just seems like there is something that doesn't really make a lot of sense. It doesn't really add up because we need to bring in apparently a ton of immigration. We don't know where we're going to house these people. We don't know how our infrastructure is going to even handle that many people. Yet at the same time, it's not like our universities here are exactly cheap. And so, who are these international students? Where are they coming from? How are they faring here? And are they kind of coming in through an international student program that our government is now pushing forward in order to just funnel foreign wealth into the country? Because you can't exactly come and go to school here like you could in Europe if if you're from Venezuela, right? Like there are certain people that this particular type of mass immigration program is targeting.
Yeah.
And how that is going to shake out, I think is largely, going to play out over time. We're going to see that cookie crumble, like you said. But overall, I think we just have an issue of basically a failure of central planning. I mean,
Oh
that's what it
yeah, big
seems like.
time. Oh yeah, and again because of lack of cohesion between the different departments. Um,
It's incompetence at a departmental, I guess
the
at a
departmental
government.
scale.
Yeah,
And you could say, well, we could do better. And, like you mentioned earlier with China, I mean, China is the complete opposite model of this. I mean, they plan everything. And, there should be levels of cohesion that are impeccable and beyond of what we're able to even compare ourselves to. And yet they also have, made moves that now are making no sense.
right. Ghost cities and things like that.
And like forcing the population to populate areas that are underpopulated. Like these are the strategies that worked historically before I would say, digital age of technology, like the last 30, 40 years with the internet and everything else, because it was a lot easier to keep people motivated to move out to remote areas. It's very hard in 2023. People want to live in areas they want to live in. There's an interesting podcast I listened to with Peter Thiel, where he was saying that back in the 80s or the 90s, he was looking at the prices of real estate in San Francisco and saying, there is no way this can continue. People will eventually just dump these places and go move into places where they can have some land and some square footage. And he was laughing about this on the recent podcast, saying, how wrong was I? That human nature doesn't seem to work like that. We don't just pick up and go because you can buy a house in Kincardine, Ontario for $300,000. I mean, you can, you won't, you probably won't. And so some of these tendencies are very hard to justify, or hard to explain, and why we live in such overpopulated cities where there is so much more land elsewhere. Just I guess this is just how we are. We want to be communal. We want to be in areas that are developed. We want to have the infrastructure to enjoy the niceties of life, and that is just, I guess, why these areas are going to be always attracting more immigrants, people who are looking for that lifestyle, that North American lifestyle, that come from a place that's not like this, right? I come from a place that's not like this. I was born in Russia, and having come here and having enjoyed the luxuries and niceties of living in the downtown core, I mean, I don't necessarily want to move out into areas that are remote either, right? I'm just one of us. I'm just another human enjoying the infrastructure that is there for us to enjoy. So we are going to see students really struggle, because they're entering an economy that, or sorry, not even an economy, we're entering an environment that's not designed to really accommodate them.
I'm also a little bit concerned with students that are currently here trying to get into university when we're bringing in like a million students. Well, technically more than that over 2 years, right? Over a
Yeah,
million students in 2 years. Are there enough seats even, right? Are there like we need place for everybody, not just for housing, but for all the institutions as well. There just seems to be kind of like a disconnect happening, and
yeah,
I do believe that the whole concept of central planning, which is very much, I mean, look, we live in a very left-wing country, right? And getting more left-wing by the day, it seems. And I think that going to there is going to be a turning point where we just realize that central planning cannot compute the amount of computation that is necessary in order to govern an economy in an efficient way. And I was actually listening to a podcast with Robert Breedlove, who I'm a big fan of, super smart guy, and he was talking about how distributed computational systems will always outcompete centralized computational systems simply because they have more power, right? And leaving it to the individual as an autonomous individual computational device based on his or her individual values will then coincide to a larger distributed computational system, which can then power more decisions simultaneously rather than one central committee trying to dictate how it should be. Because, I mean, you come from Russia, right? In the USSR, they had the same thing. They had the pricing czar that had to make 600 plus decisions a day with, I don't know what they had, like 40 people or something, right? It's impossible. You cannot do it, right? And so obviously you're going to end up with all kinds of horrible things, right? When you take that to scale with like the Holodomor and all kinds of stuff that happened in Russia and Ukraine. I mean, it's just terrible, right? So I think that there eventually we will have to fall back on distributed computational systems in order to govern the level of economy that we have. I mean, Canada is not a small economy, right? Like we are making widespread mass decisions at such scale and ferocity over such short periods of time that increasing our population size by 5% over 2 years, I mean, that's no joke, right? Like that's a big deal. And I think that we're feeling it. And I think that the interest rates um, are going to have to reflect that. Like you said, the Bank of Canada's dealt an impossible hand, right? And every single time that they need to make another decision, there's another new thing that's come up that they need to now deal with, whether it's internal or external, right? If it's internal, it's oh, well, now we're deciding to bring in over 900,000 international students. Here, Bank of Canada, fix it, right?
Right.
And then, oh, externally, well, yeah, Evergrande has now filed for bankruptcy, and Country Garden's on the verge of collapse. Bank of Canada, deal with it, right? And
Yeah.
and there's all this pressure on Tiff McClem to make this decision of what to do, and it's kind of like no matter what he does, he's gonna get nailed to the cross either way.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Just it is what it is. There is there is almost no chance that we will ever be able to have undivided government for as long as, and this is going to be controversial right now, for as long as humans run it. Like, we just don't have the ability to make those large scale decisions without the biases that we come with. And there's an interesting book I may have referenced in the last podcast we had by Danny Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow. And in that book, he talks about how they took, I think, I can't remember the number right now, so don't quote me on this. They took a number of, I think it was like 20 or 30 different advisory firms, investment. This is all investment banking. And, these are people who had been doing this for 20, 30, 40 years, and they were trying to figure out how good are these people at actually interpreting the data to make meaningful decisions. And then they got them to pick their portfolios, and then they revisited these portfolios, I believe 10 years later, to see how well they performed. And pretty much everybody failed
Yeah.
because, and what I mean by that is that nobody was able to outperform just basically investing in like the S&P, because there's just all these decisions that they were making by selling their winners or keeping their losers or doing vice versa, that were emotional. They were not decisions based on real meaningful data. They were emotional decisions based on hearsay, or a personal sentiment towards a certain company or stock. And so these are people who make a living buying and trading and selling these assets. These are people who are confident in their own skill and ability to deliver results and to meaningfully understand information in a meaningful manner that produces those results. And even they are oblivious of how little effect they actually have on their portfolio by making those decisions, besides negative effects that they actually make by making those decisions long term. Because in the short term, they'll see some improvements and they'll just ignore their losses, so to speak, and sort of celebrate their victories. And so, like, how can we expect that a government that comes into power for 4 years, how can we expect them, even if they do have the knowledge and the political background uh, to apply some history and apply some trends from before to make decisions that appear to be good in a moment? How can they be sure? How can they be so highly effective without being able to do this in a way where they are aware of all the different variables that there are at stake, right? So, like, we probably will only ever reach an equilibrium as far as immigration goes, as far as, monetary policy goes, fiscal policy goes, when it's not governed by humans. For as long as it is governed by humans, we're unfortunately going to be always rocking this boat, going through these roller coasters. And that's just how we've done it for the past 3,000 years. And that's okay. Like, we're just going to have to manipulate it best we can until we have a better, singularity that can do it for us. And hopefully by then it'll be tame and good enough to do a good job.
Singularity is exactly what I was thinking immediately as you were talking about that. DAO's not really quite good enough. We definitely need the singularity. Maybe combine that with some quantum computing.
Like, we're only humans. We're just stupid. Like, we can't figure all this stuff out. Like, there is a point where we needed to make a stick into a spear. That's fine. You can do that. There's a point where you had to, build a fence to make sure your cattle doesn't run away. We were good at that. Once you have to start doing like stuff in large scale stuff, horrible, like atrocious. Historically, just can't figure it out. And
No, we're not.
every time that we sort of figure it out, like we did with Rome, it just all crumbles anyways because the human nature comes out and just ruins everything.
we're not hardwired for this.
No,
We are hardwired for agriculture at best, right? I mean,
probably.
like really, and we've evolved far too quickly. I'm looking at the window right now, and I'm seeing concrete jungle out there,
That's right.
right? Like that is not a natural human environment. But I do think that, like you said, our political system is flawed in the sense that the incentive structure is to get reelected within a very short amount of time, and that the average voter is not exactly educated on personal finance, let alone economics at larger scale, right? And so the, I guess, allure of blind compassion is a very powerful tool, and it seems to work especially well in Canada. And will really take that to incredible ends, to draconian ends that we saw over the last couple of years, right? And that is real. That I mean, that did happen, and that will continue to happen until we do have at least some kind of singularity sounding board to at least reflect on, that can retort against our own nature that is flawed in somewhat of a civil and patient way
Yeah,
without resorting to name calling and gaslighting. And I think
precisely.
that I would say that, like, that is my greatest hope, that we can get there. And until that happens, like, yeah, we're headed for a rocky road. I think so too.
The uh, the policies ahead are going to be um, probably um, very cut and dry. I mean, we've seen Bank of Canada do things that they had to do with no regard for affordability. So I'd say that rocky is the right word. There will be no mercy for those that are struggling, unfortunately. Everybody just has to sort of buckle up and do their best to stay afloat. Um, but like all bad times, this time will also pass, right? We'll eventually come out in better shape. It's just that, um, not without victims. And the victims that we are already noticing are obviously the people that they have no choice but to walk away from their homes and walk away from their assets, their investments, consolidate, restructure. We also saw a lot of consumer proposals and bankruptcy filings increase in 2023. There's quite an uptick since the prior years of 2020, 21, and 22. Um, and like it's also a cycle. Like this is just how these things are. As long as you understand that things are cyclical and it's not meant to stay like this in perpetuity. Um, as long as you're staying optimistic and you're able to manage your expectations and your finances in the moment, I think most will be all right that are in that position. I'm also very worried about the overall cost of living increasing drastically as well. Like the other topic that we also started talking about was the unemployment. We talked about the housing problem. There's also just like food problem. Like we also just seen the food inflation be a really big contributor towards our general inflation. And this is part of the basket that the general population really feels. So for those immigrants, for young people trying to move into the big cities and start their careers, like it's going to be very, very difficult. Because again, like I said, the cost of living, shelter, food, is all very high, right? So it's going to be very difficult to make uh, vertical moves um, for those that are starting out. So I mean, I do feel I don't feel great about that. So a lot of young people will not have the same opportunities in the upcoming next little while. But we have to stay positive, and then eventually, like I said, all bad times do eventually pass, and once they do, you just have to be ready to take advantage of the times that are ahead.
I do grow a bit concerned when things start to look a little bit too bleak. I guess to kind of your point there is, you know, this too will pass. Um, I do think that same way. But when I look at the the fact that the cost of living has skyrocketed, and we have more people and we're building less, right? Normally, on average, in just the city of Toronto, we'll build on average between 35,000 to around 38,000 units per year, on average.
Hmm.
This year, we're not even cracking 30. And the reason for that is, well, multitude of reasoning, but basically, we have a ton of red tape. We have development charges to builders have just skyrocketed, labor shortages, the cost of just construction materials obviously inflated enormously, and this is causing major issues. So we have less supply, we have more demand, yet at the same time, no one can actually afford to buy. And so it seems like our market, in some sense, doesn't really kind of drop off a cliff as much as it just kind of seizes up and just freezes over, as if it's just dropped to 40 below. And you know, I don't know if you remember this, but like, you remember when we had that huge ice storm, like where people were skating on the streets kind of thing? You remember that?
20, I'll say 13.
Yeah, yeah, it was a long time ago. It was like, yeah, it was like 10 years ago. And
I lived on the 25th floor of a building, and the elevator didn't work for 3 days. I hated going up those stairs.
Jesus, as if you didn't need more exercise. You're like exercising all the time. You're like one of the most healthy people I know. Anyways, um, I remember there being this phenomenon that we had kind of discovered as a society. Um, do you remember the ice quakes?
Ice quakes. What the hell is that?
So at that time, I was sleeping, and all of a sudden, it just sounded like a grenade went off just outside my house. And I was so scared. And I remember calling out to my brother, and we were like, "What the hell was that?" And we didn't learn about it until the next day. We heard about it, kind of like looking on the internet. But basically, what started happening is everything froze over, right? Trees fell over. Like, we lost a lot of trees that winter.
Lost a lot of wire too.
Yeah, we lost a lot of power. People were, right, like, if you had gas, you were good, but other than that, like, you were freezing to death. And people died. I mean, it was a serious thing. But what we had discovered was during the day, what would happen is the sun coming through, heating things up slightly, would melt things a little bit, and but very, very, very minutely. And then when it would drop down at night again, it would drop so quickly, the temperature, that the ice expanding on people's lawns,
Oh,
on people's roofs, would actually crack. And these were such large, massive sheets of ice that when they cracked, they created this loud boom.
damn.
And it was so loud. And that's kind of how I see our market right now, is that you have these frozen wasteland, kind of just like frozen tundras, I guess I would call them,
I like that visual. Yeah.
where like nothing's moving, right? Nothing's moving, nothing's selling, nobody's buying, but like prices aren't necessarily falling off a cliff either. It's just frozen. And then all of a sudden, you'll see one person who's like in deep trouble in that neighborhood, and they really got to sell. And that person is going to absolutely bend over, and they're going to take it on the chin, and that's going to be like that kind of like ice quake, and the whole neighborhood goes like, what the heck happened there?
Hmm.
Right? And so you're going to have this frozen tundra, you're going to have the ice quakes, you're going to have trees falling over, you're going to have the people who were exposed financially, kind of, those people are going to get into trouble. And then you're going to have the rest of everybody just kind of hunker down, light up the fireplace, and kind of wait this thing out. And that's essentially what we've been seeing for the last year and a half. And I think we're probably going to continue seeing that. The one thing that I wanted to talk to you about, because I post a lot on YouTube, and unless you're posting something that's absolutely like Armageddon on YouTube, people don't like it. And when, and when you kind of say, hey, look, everything's gonna be fine, just hunker down and don't be stupid with your money, you know, then like people are like absolutely kind of start like roasting in the comments. Just wait, it's all coming crumbling down, and real estate prices gonna fall, and but the thing that I notice is that when they do that, it's as if they're doing it in an attempt to kind of, or at least with this implication that you don't know what you're talking about. Real estate prices are going to absolutely tank, and then I'm going to snap some up. But what I always kind of go back to, and I wanted to talk to you about this because you understand how the system works really, really well, is that if real estate prices in Toronto and the GTA fall by whatever these guys want to say they're going to fall by 70%, 80%, it's not like anyone's going to have the money to be able to snap up real estate. At that point in time, our entire economy runs on real estate here. We are a real estate focused and real estate driven economy. We're going to be fighting over carrots and potatoes if that happens. Like, it's nobody's going to be taking advantage of that unless you're really, really, really cash heavy right now, which very few people are.
Um, if real estate in Toronto and GTA dropped by 70%, we probably lost to China. Like the West probably lost to China. Like that's the only way that I can see prices in the West dropping that much uh, at all. Like the West has to go into such steep decline for us to really witness something like that, that I don't know if you even want to live here beyond that point. Like, and when I say live here, I don't know if if rhetorically that means live here in Canada or just in general on this earth, because it may not be worth, at that point, things might be not good at all, right? Like, for the real estate prices to tank that much, it has to be an almost Armageddon. Um, like, it's just that, we have so many people of influence and so many people with money in control of our system, making sure that it does not tank, making sure that their assets are safe, making sure that the assets of their investors and their contacts and their families and whatnot are also safe. The government will intervene almost every time it will feel the threat of tanking that bad or even remotely close to that bad, and will do everything that it possibly can to maintain some level of stability. And if it doesn't, then things are probably not good to a degree that I think housing would be very last concern at that point. Like I think, like you said, if it's that much of an impact, and that's what the person in the YouTube comments is looking to when they're looking to capitalize on their real estate purchase. I mean, if you're thinking those thoughts, you might as well start like stocking up on canned tomatoes and beans and maybe instead be looking to set up a bunker. Like it's just that is not quite possible without something so significant that it almost changes the way we live. And if that's how you live your life and you live your life on the assumption that that will come one day, maybe you're right, maybe I'm wrong, but that is not a life I'm prepared to live. Right? I think it's important for us as a society, as a community, to stay optimistic and not be optimistic that prices of real estate are always going to grow, but be optimistic within reason. I think that a statement that prices will probably stagnate for a very long period of time, that some pockets of real estate in Canada will lose value and stabilize at a value that is more acceptable to the neighborhood that they're in. The statement that uh, this is how it will probably deal with its crisis is a lot more likely. And that's kind of the analogy that I like you use with the cracking ice. That kind of is how it has been, right? Like we would see things sort of start to contract and shrink and prices drop, and then all of a sudden, like the government will come out with some sort of an intervention and they'll change things for the better in a short period of time. So I I would much rather for us to stay optimistic and maybe be wrong than be pessimistic and right. So we're just gonna stay optimistic. We're not gonna feed into those fears. If things are gonna go that bad, I think we'll have a lot more other concerns to worry about. Let's focus on having a healthy economy. Let's focus on having healthy employment rate, healthy inflation rate, and do what we can as a community to get there, right? You know, Everybody is contributing in one way or the other by doing their job, and Just go into work is one part of it. Staying alert and making sure that you are aware of what's happening out there is the other thing you can do, right? Participate in your local elections is another thing you can do. Um, but you can't, you can't control it the way the people with the levers can. And so we just have to sort of make sure that we keep them in check and we address our frustration with them in every possible channel that we can, right? By going to the election box on election day, by expressing our frustration online. I think the social media is doing a good job on sort of putting pressure on our government to produce, again, meaningful results, but we also should be giving them a little bit of credit when, those results do take time to achieve.
Having said that, I mean, I know I'm not a fan and you're not a fan of our federal government at this point. Um, in the spirit of optimism,
Hmm.
Steelman an argument for, for me for what they have done that is contributing to a better outlook right now.
Simple. We all hate stress test in the mortgage industry. What a blessing was it when we had it? I mean, like, look at how much people are struggling right now with the interest rates and a 6% interest rate that, we're not expecting. And if we were qualifying everybody without the stress test of 5.25, how big the gap would have really been, right? Like in hindsight, what an innovation to the financing industry that felt like a blindsided decision when it was made in the very beginning. Something as simple as forcing the consumer to apply for CMHC insurance with minimal down payment. I mean, it insulated us against a lot of what happened in the States in 2007, 2008, right? Like, there are things that our government has done that long term seem to have worked out for the best. We don't celebrate those victories because they're not obvious. And when they are obvious, they're obvious to professionals and obvious to those people that are knowledgeable about the topic, not just the general population, right? Like, if you are aware of what the stress is, if you're listening to this podcast and you have been following the Canadian real estate, you probably understand what I'm talking about. But somebody who has not been exposed to home ownership doesn't really fully understand the meaning of that word. So how can they possibly really comment on that, right? But again, like these are things that were meaningful when they were made, and they created a lasting impact. I mean, I'm not gonna start going through a list of them, but there's just a couple of examples, let's say.
I never really considered that. I'm actually really glad I asked the question because I'd never really considered that. And you're absolutely right. The stress test, hindsight being 2020, was a great decision. I mean, like
Yeah,
it did help insulate us up from, the worst happening because I guess everybody does kind of look at things with blinders on, right? And in a narrow scope because we do have a very highly specialized economy where everybody kind of is really, really good at one thing. And then we rely on those people
yeah,
as our specialists, and we kind of do that for everything. When we're looking at things and yeah, we're watching some videos, and of course, YouTube is very polarizing to begin with, anyways, and pushes for that content. Of course, seeing interest rates go up, oh, these fools who got their rates when rates were 2%, and now they're gonna blow up and die, and everything's gonna kind of like, just come crumbling down. You're absolutely right. I never really thought about that as, hey, no, they had actually qualified at a much, much higher rate because we did
yeah,
have that stress test to kind of make sure that should those interest rates actually boom up, then we're okay. And so, yeah, I'd never really considered that. I also think that there is one thing that I want to ask you on the flip side. If there is one part of the current climate for homeowners, home buyers, in terms of the regulatory process that kind of you have to go through when you're pre-qualifying somebody that you feel should be changed, what do you think it would be and why?
Hmm. What would I change? I mean, like, the only change that I can think of that should have been done but hasn't been done that would probably make a big impact on fraud in the industry is if you just simply permitted financial institutions and banks and brokers direct access to CRA, that innovation would clean up the house.
Tell me more about that.
So if you are qualifying for a mortgage in the current dynamic when you're going to the bank, right? You sign an application, you fill out your information. The bank will often generate their approval just based on what you put in the application, right? So that's one way of pre-qualifying for a mortgage. There is no underwriting being done up front. None of the documentation is often being referenced, but the information being judged for what it is. Not very accurate most of the time. Plenty of mistakes happen as a result of it, so a lot of those pre-approvals do fall through. If in the moment of signing up for that application, the purchaser had, given their permission to the bank or the financial institution to just simply check their CRA account only for a couple of different lines. I don't need the full CRA access. Just give me like line 150, just so I can cross-reference some of the information on your documents later and know that I'm correct with my calculations.
So you're saying right now we have a system where we trust and don't verify, and you're
Yes.
saying no, we should create a system where it's trust but verify.
Yes, and not only that, not only would it improve the financial institutions' ability to produce more accurate pre-approvals that actually have some weight to them, it would also eliminate a lot of the fraud because no, like right now, if there's obviously like you'll hear stories about the CBC marketplace with like some bankers taking a fee for fiddling around with documents and getting your file approved, right? Well, how could you possibly do that if when you submit your application to the bank verifies your line 150 on notice of assessment?
Right. So you're saying that the incentive in place, or let me rephrase that, the risk to reward calculation that someone is making when they are committing fraud and saying, here are my falsified documents to a bank, the repercussions are basically
Well, they
nothing.
just they can't. It's very hard to catch, right?
Right.
Like if the documents, and I've received documents that were fraudulent. I'm not a specialist in fraud, so I would unfortunately sometimes not be able to spot it.
No, but what I'm saying is, I guess what I'm saying is, if you submit falsified documents
Yeah,
to a mortgage broker like yourself, to a bank, whatever,
I don't know.
but if they were to get caught, the repercussions are nowhere near as severe as if they were to lie to the CRA and then get
Well,
caught.
that too, right? But even if there were no further repercussions beyond just being caught in the moment in the act of fraud, that would clean up the real estate market from all the transactions that shouldn't have been originated in the first place. And what I'm talking about is a very large portion of mortgage portfolios for some of the bigger banks in Canada having been generated through fraudulent applications, right? That would ultimately allow people who do not qualify for these homes buy homes of significantly greater value that they can possibly service or qualify for, irregardless of the stress test. They just don't qualify to begin with, which drives prices of real estate up, allows those applicants who are well versed in fraud to buy multiple properties with little down payment, right? Because they're just making up paper, like it's just all big story with no real substance to it, which also contributes to the housing crisis. So like if in the last 10, 20 years, these types of, and this didn't have to be even digital. You could just literally have a permission to the bank to call the CRA and just confirm like two numbers. You know what I mean? Like even if you had that for the past 10 to 20 years, I think that would have made a very big impact on how much this real estate market is out of control in 2023 with the prices of real estate.
Right, because that would have also opened up more opportunity for people
Who actually do
who
qualify.
actually do qualify and do need the housing instead of giving it to fraudsters who can't actually pay their mortgage and then come due they're starting to actually hurt the value of the whole neighborhood for
And
everyone.
like, it's not uncommon that those types of fraudulent transactions were placed, like the offers were placed unconditional because these purchasers were given pretty much a green light and okay, go, don't worry about anything, I'll get it done type of a message from their broker or their specialist. And they're competing against good borrowers who come from good brokers who've been pre-qualified, pre-approved, but have been told to be cautious because there is a limit to what you can do without fraud. And you have to be very proactive about understanding that limit and to be very careful not to exceed that limit. And so those borrowers are going out there placing offers with conditions, right, for inspections, for financing, because they're being cautious and they're being diligent purchasers. Whereas you have all these, like I said, fraudulent applications and all these guys going out there placing offers with no conditions because they've been told not to worry. Like the dynamic that this created in the market also led to a lot more probably multiple offers, led to a lot more prices being driven way beyond where they should have been left at, and a lot more qualified borrowers and buyers being left outside of the market because they just simply couldn't compete with somebody who is not playing by the rules.
And in a cloak and dagger kind of way too, right? That affects the market at large.
Over a long period of time, this creates a snowball effect. And then, like, and then digital age came and nothing changed. Like, this ability to call into CRA and verify information has been available to accountants for years. Like it's called the T1013 that you sign. It's a form, it's just one page. You sign it, you can give permission to your accountant to call CRA, discuss information on your behalf. I think there's even some things they can request and change and whatnot. Um, like that's a standard form. It's not hard to sign. It's not hard to get. If the bank gets it signed on, up front and it verifies the information with the CRA, it eliminates pretty much all possibility of fraud. And in the digital age, that process has been now simplified where the bank can simply place a request electronically and it comes back like a couple of hours later and it just tells you everything you need to know. Like it's not a hard thing to do. It just needs to be integrated, right?
Well, regulators, if you're listening, that's what you can do to help. Um,
But this stuff takes time to integrate, right? Like the other part of it as well is, well, they have to communicate with the CRA about what may or may not be permittable. And because there is such disconnect between the different departments of the government, again, there's just so much red tape you got to go through. So I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying it's a direction we should be going towards if we want to improve the industry and to answer your first question, if we want to improve the mortgage qualifying process in a way that will benefit the consumer long term. And I'm talking about the good consumer long term.
totally. We have to always be moving in the direction of eliminating the ability for fraudsters to eat up real estate that and homes that people truly need in order to survive here, especially if you're a newcomer, like we were speaking about, who are coming here for a better life and have nowhere to go.
Nowhere to go, and no real prospects of that shelter becoming available. Like we also aren't doing really anything about construction either, right? So that's another part of this whole dilemma that we're again facing because of such disconnect in the government departments because they don't communicate to one another well enough, and the ones that are building the developers for constructing apartment buildings are not being put enough pressure on to lower their levies and costs of those permits and construction. Um, um, for no good reason. Like, why aren't we doing more about that? Like, somebody put out, and this was, I think, first quarter of the year, someone put out a comprehensive comparison of the cost of raising a condo versus the cost of raising an apartment building with the profit margin just also visualized in the form of a graph. So it's just a little bit easier for us, the common people, to understand why is it that developers aren't building apartment buildings, right? And it was just such a drastic difference where I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was something like, like a 25% profit margin on a condo construction and like a 9% profit margin on an apartment building. Like, why would you? What's the point? And then if you have construction cost overruns like we did recently, what are you just gonna build this apartment building at no cost, like no profit? What if it just eats up all your cost? Like you want a healthy 25% profit margin so that you have room for error, right? So if we don't fix that problem, you know, which has been a problem unattended for the past 20 years for the most part, like we really haven't done much about it.
In
Um,
fact, we've made it worse.
we have made it worse. And when you look at the number of buildings that are meant to be affordable, raised in metropolitan areas like Toronto and Vancouver, in the last 60, 70 years. I mean, it was all done in the 80s. Like it has not picked up since. It has just been declining. And the reason that is because we are not paying attention to it. You know, we had a boom in construction. It served its purpose, and then shortly after we forgot about it, and we just kind of shoved it under the rug because we had other problems to deal with, and because of this disconnect in the government priorities. And our disconnect with the government priorities, or our disconnect with the government in general, like we don't know what the government priorities are, and we're not really following them. And what we're being faced with right now with all these crises with real estate and whatnot are in fact problems that, like, unfortunately should have been addressed by our parents, like back in the 90s, when these tendencies started to show their ugly faces. Not in 2020s or 2010s, when these, like, I know our parents are on their way out of the economy, like they're mostly retiring now, and we're being dealt this hand that is virtually impossible to win. In the short term anyways. Long term we'll see.
Well, I do think that we're in a place where we need to let up on builders. Like we have this, and Toronto's kind of, I guess, an anomaly in a lot of ways too, because we are a very densely populated city that is getting more and more densely populated, where we have people who are definitely leaning left wing, kind of demanding more housing, yet at the same time, if a builder tries to do some infill project, all of a sudden, like the NIMBY mentality comes out and it just makes it virtually impossible. Then all of a sudden we have a socialist mayor now in Toronto, kind of just like ramming development fees down these builders' throats. And I mean, because she has a lot of plans, right? Olivia Chow's got a lot of plans, and she doesn't have a way to make money for her grand plans other than raising property taxes, which makes it harder for first-time buyers to actually achieve purchasing a home. Um, Raising like parking levies, which is like whatever, right? And then raising development charges, which again is makes it harder for first time buyers because it just gets passed on to the consumer because the builders uh, on razor thin margins right now and doesn't pay, right, especially in a tumultuous market like this, to start putting up projects right now, because if the markets change a little bit, right, labor shortages get worse, right, construction material costs go up. I mean, like that's it, right? They gotta cancel that project because they're not going to make any money on it. So to have all of these different things happening simultaneously are extremely contradictory. Like you can't have NIMBY mentality towards infill projects that builders are trying to create more density in the city for, and at the same time raising the development charges and raising the property taxes and just making everything more filled with friction, right? And we need to start smoothing out that friction because it is just far too much for the consumer to bear at this point, and their income cannot support that. And are a lot of pressure is being placed on, you know, employment right now, right? To hold everything up, and it's not easy. And I think that if we do see a rise in unemployment, like we're in big trouble if that happens, right? We've got a lot riding on employment staying high right now. So I do think that we are in a very weird place right now. And this is why I was kind of like, you know what? Let's do a podcast. Let's kind of like talk about the issues, no matter how broad and big they are, because ultimately at the end of the day, there are so many factors kind of happening at once. And I think it is a good thing for people to kind of get educated on the perspective of people who are in the industry and kind of like talk about these things at length with no time limit. Like tell me your thoughts. Let's talk to people who are like boots on the ground and kind of see what they're seeing. Let's talk about the things that are happening that the news is not paying attention to because it's not clickbaity enough, right? Like why is no one talking about over 900,000 international students being brought into the country in 1 year, right? Why are we not talking about the mass immigration boom that Canada is seeing, where we are such an outlier? We have mass immigration happening at a scale that no other country in the world is seeing right now. In 2 years, we are going to increase our population size by over 5%. That's insane.
pretty
it's
nuts.
it's wild. It's wild. And so I like having these conversations and kind of like talking these things through, because we are such in this place of uncertainty right now where I do feel like the supply and demand pressures are just like colliding, like
Yeah.
two running backs at full speed.
Well, something to say about development that is positive. So we've been given the ability in Toronto specifically to densify single family dwellings into up to 4 units, right? So you can now also the other thing that's also happened is we are now seeing the topic of garden suites becoming more prevalent.
I actually got a phone call from a company that actually does that.
Yeah, so garden suites have become a lot more prevalent, and here's why. So this isn't also on the news. This is just literally from the research I've done by calling all the different banks and talking to them. And I also done a fair number of garden suites in the last little while, so I was just curious as to how the banks are going to look at them because the issue with densifying properties in Toronto historically been that it has gotten easier recently to take, let's say, a single family dwelling and turn it into a duplex or a triplex or a fourplex because the city encourages it because we are now acknowledging the housing crisis. But another thing that also happened is garden suites, which have been historically one of the ways people, especially like in places like California, for example, are able to create an additional income stream. They've become a topic of conversation in Toronto as well, because now you've been essentially given the green light to not only densify your property by making it into a duplex, triplex, or a fourplex, you're also now allowed to have a garden suite on the same property, right? And the issue with garden suite in the past was that in Toronto, if you're buying a house and you're financing it with a bank financing, banks do not pay attention to income generated or value generated through any structures outside of the main building. So if you own a home that's worth $1 million and you bought it and you built a garden suite in the back, that's phenomenal, like modern, top of the line everything. And it cost you $300,000 to build and it's generating $3,000 per month. Up until this year, it meant nothing to the bank.
That's crazy.
This is the first summer, 2023 is the first summer where garden suites are officially part of the program's description for some, not all banks, but some more alternative banks, I would call them, where they are given both the value to the garden suite as well as the main house, as well as they consider the rental income just like regular income, same as the main house. So that's generating an ability for you to have an additional unit in this kind of a property that in a city like Toronto can generate significant income, right?
The thing is, so I got a call from one of these companies that actually builds garden suites
Yeah.
on properties. And I talked to them for a while, and I actually am gonna try to get them on the podcast to kind of talk it out with them. It seems like a lot more of a possibility outside of the city, just because lots are bigger. They have a lot of different things that they still have to make sure that you're eligible to actually be able to do it. So first of all, you need to have the power. You can't have an 100 amp service entrance cable and be able to power our garden suite as well. You need
Yes,
200
you got to dig things. It's not easy. I'm not saying it's simple. There's quite
No,
a bit of
no.
infrastructural stuff you got to improve.
Yeah, and like you need to have like the proper setbacks and things like that.
Yeah.
You need to actually have the land to be able to do it. You need to have the power to be able to do it. But if you are in a place like Richmond Hill, right, that we're in right now,
Or Mississauga.
Mississauga, there are a lot of suburb areas that have become increasingly expensive. Richmond Hill in particular, by the way, is insanely expensive. Price per square foot here has skyrocketed.
Hmm.
And there are a lot of lots here that you can find that are enormous lots where they do have the power, they do have the ability to be able to add in those garden suites. And yeah, if you're gonna, be able to go to a bank, and Omi and Opa has been living there for a long time, and all of a sudden they can go and say, hey, look, I'd like to refinance the house, pull out $300,000 so that I can build this garden suite. Like,
Let's go. Call me.
let's go. So, Yeah, definitely something to end on on a high note for, because that is something that I think brings a lot more density, brings a lot more options, and overall, I think it is just a positive thing that we are now seeing in the marketplace. And I hope to see more of that because I do think that we desperately need it.
Yeah, that's been one of the things I've been spending a lot of time doing lately is considering these garden suite projects. It's also just once you do one or two, people obviously find out and they start calling you about all of them. So garden suites has been a hot topic of conversation. I've gotten a lot more knowledgeable about them in the last year and a half, I'd say, because again, like I said, number of inquiries started to increase. Um, do your own research on the topic of garden suites. If you're curious about doing some sort of a project like that, I highly recommend having three parties involved from the very early stage. One is you want to have a realtor who is helping you understand the value of the home based on having the garden suite added to your property to see what the result value may be.
Give
You
me a
need to,
call.
right, give Adam a call. So you need a general contractor to figure out the cost of building the garden suite, and you need somebody who's experienced in building those exact types of suites in your municipality, because they will know how much it's going to cost to get permits and things the right way. And third is obviously you want to figure out what the cost of financing that construction is and what the mortgage will look like on the way out, because you need to obviously make sure that when the garden suite is finished and it's able to generate you initial two, three, $4,000 per month, that you have an institutional exit that makes sense. Because obviously, carrying construction financing at 10 to 12% interest rate is no fun long term. So you want to get out of that as soon as you can. So garden suites have been a hot topic. They will become a hotter topic over the next little while as we are seeing, an influx of people entering markets like Toronto and GTA looking for shelter, looking for homes. And I think that is an investment worth considering if you are in a position to spend some money to make some money, right?
If you have a ton of equity in your home,
If you have a lot that can hold it really.
Yeah, exactly. And you're comfortable with that. I also think there's another really, really positive element to it that I think that we just don't experience here just because uh, landlords and tenants are so disconnected from
Mhm.
one another here, and there's a ton of friction there. Is that if your tenant is living on your property and like you're literally steps away from each other, there's a lot higher of an incentive for both parties to be kind to one another. And I think that I think that that's a really good thing because I
Yeah.
know, like, my girlfriend and I spend a lot of time in the winters in Costa Rica, and that's one thing that's like super popular there is people will build on a lot and they'll build
Mhm.
two units with like a shared pool in between, Airbnb one of them out, live in another one, and that's like a very common thing to do. Construction costs are much more simple and cheaper there. And what it does is
Makes
it
sense.
yeah, and it creates a community that's a lot more cohesive. People are, it's a lot harder to be mean to somebody's face, I think, than it is to be through, a tribunal of the landlord tenant board.
It's like a supervised rental, right? Like it's not just a rental out there somewhere with nobody paying attention to it. It is being supervised, so it is going to be higher quality, better maintained, and well managed. Um, and banks are realizing that now, right? So that's why they're opening up the gates, whereas before they were very cautious to talk on this topic at all. They would pretty much just evade it best they could. But that is a positive change that I'd say that happened recently. I am literally delivering this message to you guys right now, only I think after about 2 or 3 weeks of finding this out. This is very, very new information. So I would, again, like I said, recommend looking into it if you are in a position to do it, because if the garden suites that I have been lucky enough to complete recently and see go out on the market have been renting out for a good coin, right? Like if there's one project that we recently did that was in the Little Italy area in Toronto, and that area generates over $3,000 per one bedroom, or sorry, per two-bedroom unit. So I think the two-bedroom that they built there for a garden suite went for well over 3 grand per month, right? So think about it, like if it costs 300, $400,000 to build, even at 10%, it sort of pays for itself, but it's an asset that's part of your house now.
Well,
So
it also increases the equity in your home, the
right,
value of your
yeah,
property.
that's what I mean. And if you can take it out with an institutional mortgage at the end of, let's say, your current term, okay, that sounds good.
I think it's also super valuable to people who are coming here from overseas and are buyers that are multi-generational families living together, which is a very popular thing here.
Oh yeah,
We have a lot of people coming in from China, and typically it's pretty normal to see a couple different generations living together in one home where you have the grandparents kind of taking care of the kids while the parents are away at work.
this is the future norm. I am putting my foot down on this right now. This garden suite scheme is going to be the future norm in places like Toronto. Give it 10 years. It will be one of those hot topics like, we used to talk about basements 10 years ago as one of the ways to improve your household cash flow. Garden suites are way better. They're separate structures. There's no need to worry about separate entrances in your building. There's some seclusion for both parties. And now that the gates are open, that is definitely going to be the future of how we're going to densify real estate opportunities in Toronto and make an impact on this housing crisis um, long term.
Well, that's a great positive note to end up on because we've kind of gone on a roller coaster of like, the positive and negative things happening in the marketplace right
Yeah,
now, and it's a really interesting time. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming in, taking the
pleasure.
time, trekking down here. I know it's always a kind of, a bitch battling traffic,
All good.
but I thank you so much for making the trek. And if you guys like this conversation and you want to see more of it, please let me know in the comments below. More than happy to bring more conversations like this to you. And if you haven't already, like this video so this content can be pushed out to more people like yourself, and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much, buddy.
Thank you. Cheers. Boom. Cheers, guys.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, follow, and give us a review.